All right, thank you, Tony. Good morning, members of the Commission, Chairman Cooper, Secretary Vonk. Looks like I'm the last one on the agenda, and I promise I won't go quite as long as Andy, but the content will be just as good, I hope. All right, like he said, I'm just going to give a little update on our 2013 pheasant population and harvest estimate, and also a little update on our prairie grouse harvest from last year. If we just start out with pheasant, last year we harvested just under 1 million pheasants, right at 982,000. This was the first time we've dipped down under 1 million since about 1997. Remember back in 1997, it was a year after a pretty harsh winter, and it was the last time we were at that level. If we look back to about a year ago, we harvested about 1.4 million birds. We're substantially lower than our 10-year average and our 20-year average. These are really some of our, especially our 10-year average, that's really a representative of the glory days and a time period when the stars really aligned for good pheasant populations out there. Like most of you know, our hunter numbers really declined last year after that forecast came out with pretty tough bird numbers out there. Our hunter numbers did decline by close to 20%, which is 30,000 hunters, so it was a pretty substantial decline in hunter numbers from the previous year. Our birds harvested per person, also dipped a little bit with that decline in population. Last year we were averaging almost 9 birds per hunter, and this past year it was about 7.5. I think the last time our birds per person was that low was back in 1989, so it was a pretty low bird number per person. As far as our population estimate, that came in at just a little over 6 million birds. That's down from about 7.6 million last year, and it's only really represented about a 20% decline. And if you kind of remember that number from our brood survey last year, we anticipated about a 60% decline in our brood survey, and this doesn't align real great. And much of what I'm going to talk about today is kind of address that and explain why that might be. Again, this population estimate is substantially lower than our 10 and 20-year averages, especially that 10-year average when we had just superb pheasant numbers out there. I just wanted to share a couple maps of kind of where our hunter and harvest distribution was across the state last year. Pretty similar to past years. Our harvest is usually highest in that James River Valley, and then just a little bit west into that kind of Missouri, Coteau, and that Lyman, Tripp, Gregory County areas. One thing that is a little bit different than kind of where we were 3 or 4 years ago, that Lyman, Tripp, Gregory, Brule County were kind of in a world of their own a few years ago. They were harvesting substantially higher density of birds than anywhere in the state. And this past year, they were a little bit more representative to some of these other counties, and that's certainly what our brood survey showed, that these areas were similar abundance as some other areas, and which wasn't really the case 3 or 4 years ago. Similar to our harvest distribution, our hunter distribution is pretty similar. Most of these pheasant hunters are doing their homework. They know where the birds are, and it pretty much mirrors where the birds are. We see our highest hunter density. So I just wanted to share a couple slides here on kind of the trends in our pheasant harvest. As we look back here, like I said earlier, that mid to late 2000s was some of the highest pheasant numbers we've ever seen. We were harvesting close to 2 million birds for quite a few years there. In 2007, we were over 2 million birds. It was, just phenomenal pheasant hunting in this state. We've really seen that pretty consistent decline since 2007. This past year, like I said, we were just under 1 million birds. Very similar. This is just a look back at our preseason population estimate going back to 2001. Really, the stars aligned here. We had about 1.5 million acres of CRP on the ground, a couple of really good mild winters in a row, and our pheasant population was through the roof, almost 12,000 birds back in 2007. Since 2007, it's been a bit of a rough road. We've lost 500,000 acres of CRP since 2007. We've also had pretty rough winters in 2009, 2010, and 2011. We get to 2012 and we didn't catch a break. We had a severe drought. Then we get to 2013 and we had one of the coldest springs on record. So it's been a tough series of years here for pheasants in South Dakota. Like I said earlier, our pheasant population for 2013 didn't decline as much as our roadside survey indice did. This next slide here will just kind of show you a comparison of how our roadside survey indice tracks with our pheasant population estimate. I want to point out that the two sources of data that we use for these two population indices are pretty much independent. So to see them track as well as they have over these past years really shows us that both of these surveys are pretty robust when they really align most years. When you look at 2013, you see a big difference in those. Our brood survey declined by 64%, and our population estimate only declined by 19%. And I've got a few slides coming up here to kind of maybe explain why that difference occurred. You may wonder what kind of goes into generating that population estimate. What that population estimate is based on, it's just a formula that includes our pheasant harvest for that year, our preseason sex ratio, which comes from our brood surveys, and then also our postseason pheasant sex ratio, which comes from some winter composition counts where we go out and count flocks of birds and record how many hens and roosters are out there. You're probably more familiar with our brood survey, that solid line. That's when we drive our 110 30-mile routes in August and get a pheasants per mile index from the number of birds we count. So just a little bit different way to look at this data. Here's the PPM from our roadside surveys and our preseason population estimate on this other axis. And like I said earlier, these two population indices, which are based on pretty much independent data, have tracked really well over the years. And when we get our results of our roadside surveys, we're pretty confident that it's representative of what's going on out there because we see this really nice correlation over the years. This red dot here is kind of what we saw this past year. It's a definite outlier when you look at 20 years of data. So it kind of makes us wonder, what happened? What could cause that? And if we remember back a year ago to last spring, we had one of the coldest springs on record. Much of eastern South Dakota had 20 to 30 inches of snow. We had temperatures, into the single digits in early May, which is really unheard of. And we're pretty confident that that would delay the nesting season. And that could have made some birds not as detectable during our roadside surveys. And that kind of may explain why our pheasants per mile declined so severely. And it might be not as representative of what was really going on out there. Another explanation could be some bias in the population estimate. And I've got some slides that might explain how we might see some bias in our population estimate. But it sure makes you wonder if maybe, that dot, if our pheasants per mile index was biased a little bit and our population estimate was biased a little bit, it could maybe move that dot a little bit closer to what you'd expect. So, the question you're probably asking, was the fall population higher than expected given the low PPM that we saw from our August roadside survey? And I sure think there's a possibility of that. It's a pretty big difference between 64% decline from one survey and 19% from the other survey. What we are confident in is we were certainly down this past fall, and what the true number is, we may never know. But we must also, consider that our birds per person, the lowest since 1989. That's a pretty good indication that our population was at a pretty low level. When we look at our population estimate, it was pretty close to what we saw in 2011 when we killed 1.55 million birds. So that's kind of a red flag that maybe our population estimate was a little bit higher than what you'd think. So one of the most important pieces of data that goes into our population estimate is that postseason winter sex ratio, where we go out in the wintertime, count these compositions of wintering birds with a white background with some snow on the ground, and use that into that formula to see how the hunting pressure in the fall kind of shifted that sex ratio. And what we saw when we collected the data this past year was almost 60 roosters per 100 hens on the landscape. And this was the highest value we've ever recorded with this survey. And when you record the highest value that you've ever recorded with a survey that we've been doing for this long, it's sure going to make you scratch your head and look at that and try to explain why that happened. When I saw this data, I was pretty surprised, but it also made me put my thinking cap on and try to explain what was going on. And one thing, we had 31,000 fewer hunters on the landscape. So that's 31,000 less people killing roosters, which are going to prevent that sex ratio from being shifted as much, just because less birds are being harvested. So if we would have just guessed that those 30,000 hunters killed on average 7.5 birds, it would move that sex ratio down to a much more reasonable level, down to about 50 birds. Still pretty high and still higher than I'd expect, but it's definitely a little bit more palatable than that 60 birds per 100. I should point out that the higher this sex ratio is, the higher your population estimate's going to come out. Just another way of looking at pretty much that same type of data, what we do know is when our population is high, we typically kill a lower proportion of the available birds, and when our population is high, we kill a lower proportion of our birds, and it kind of shows this trend line. When our population is at near record highs, we're killing less than 40% of our birds, and when our population is really low, sometimes we'll kill 60% of them just because there's less birds out there, and hunters do a little bit better job of cleaning them up. That red dot here is what we expect, or is the data from this past year. And again, you can see it's a bit of an outlier. Again, if we just guess on if those 30,000 hunters would have been hunting this year, it kind of moves it a little bit closer to what you'd expect. But I think both of these slides just kind of show you that we might have seen a little bit of a bias in our population estimate. And one reason that could be is this past winter, our conditions for counting birds during our winter sex ratio, it was within protocol. We had a white background sometimes, but with that mild winter, we also at times had lack of snowfall. And as you can imagine, the hens blend into a brown background a little bit more than the roosters. So if our conditions this winter maybe biased our counts of roosters, that would inflate the population estimate a little bit, and it might kind of help explain why we're seeing some of these anomalies in the data. Just one other interesting, relationship between our August roadside surveys and our harvest. These blue dots or blue bars are just kind of showing you per year what our change in pheasants per mile was for that particular year. The bars that are above this line are greater than 0. The ones that are below were less than 0. And then I also have right beside it the change in harvest. So for instance, in 2013, our PPM dropped 64%, but the harvest only dropped about 50%. And if you kind of look back over the last 6 years, we've seen that same thing about 3 years ago and 6 years ago, that when we record these drastic changes in our roadside surveys, our harvest doesn't move that much. And we've seen this trend over and over. And it's just kind of another piece of evidence that when we see these huge changes in our roadside surveys, that we should maybe kind of interpret those with a grain of salt, and it might not actually be that bad. So, in conclusion, like I said, we saw quite a bit different results between our two survey indices, which in the past have performed pretty well. So it kind of makes us wonder what that true decline from 2012 was with our population estimate. And given this new set of data, I'm pretty confident that we're somewhere in between. I think we've got some pieces of information that suggest that our roadside surveys might have kind of over-exaggerated that decline last year. But I also have a few reservations that with our population estimate that it might be biased a little bit high. So I'm pretty confident that we're somewhere in between that 19 and 64% decline. One thing we always have to remember is all survey data are estimates, and they're not always going to trend perfectly. Most of the time they do. Sometimes we're going to have situations like this where it's going to take a little more explaining and a little bit more interpretation to really figure out what's going on out there. And while it's kind of unfortunate we have this much uncertainty in the data, I'm interpreting this as good news. We finally got a piece of information that suggests that our dismal forecast last fall might not have been quite that bad. So don't like that uncertainty, but I sure like having a piece of good news for once. I just had one slide here to share results of our prairie grouse harvest information last fall. Like I said, we had a very, very poor spring weather conditions last year that we know hurt our pheasants, and it certainly seems that this very cold and wet spring we had last year had negative impacts on prairie grouse production too, as reflected in the harvest. We don't have any other really good surveys of a prairie grouse like a pheasant brood survey per se, but this piece of data here does suggest that prairie grouse harvest was pretty tough last year. And just wanted to finish up here with a slide related to CRP. We certainly know how important CRP has been to our pheasant population, and we kind of know that we've been seeing a pretty steady decline since 2007 with our CRP acres. Right now we're at a little bit under a million acres of CRP, and when we plot out the maximum projected losses out to 2020, you can see that we could easily be down to that 600,000 acre ballpark. This is if no other acres were enrolled, so these are maximum projected losses. One thing we've seen here in the past 4 to 5 years with high commodity prices is our general CRP signups have been pretty poor. We're only getting 20,000 acres through some of our general CRP signups. But we do have about 150,000 acres of continuous CRP acres that are ready to be enrolled, so hopefully that can kind of buffer this loss in the future. With that, I'd take any questions and share a good picture of what I hope our pheasant nesting cover is looking like here in the coming weeks, and really hoping we don't have any extreme weather this spring, because we could sure use a break.